So welcome everyone to the second forum for Women, Gender Studies, and Religion. We're really happy to see you all here. The first one, I presume that many of you were here, was Professor Amy Hollywood, and now this time we have Professor Sarah Coakley. We will continue to run these things next semester as well, and actually we have, hopefully first on our agenda, we are thinking in terms of doing a panel discussion, hopefully with a couple of faculty members and a couple of students, in which we're still in the process of formulating what the topic will be about, but something addressing our current situation here in terms of what's going on now for the study of women and gender religion, and also where do we want to go. That's in the most simplest terms, but if anyone has particular takes on that particular question, issues that they'd like to see discussed, please write me an email and we'll try to formulate a topic that addresses many of our concerns, primarily on intellectual issues, curricular issues, intellectual, community issues, and so on. And also anyone who's actually interested in participating in such a panel, let me know. And we'll let you know when these things happen. There should be at least 3 such forums in the spring as well. So tonight we have the great pleasure of seeing Professor Coakley is going to be here thinking in front of us and thinking with us on some of her new work. Professor Coakley hardly needs an introduction, but you may not all know that she's the Edward Mallinckrodt Professor of Divinity. She is a systematic theologian and philosopher of religion, and as you know, has also done a great deal of work in gender theory and other domains. Her background is primarily from the University of Cambridge, but she does have a THM from Partridge Divinity School.
Fatal.
Never the same thereafter. The titles of some of her more recent books: Powers and Submissions, Spirituality, Philosophy, and Gender, that was 2002. Rethinking Gregory of Nyssa, which is an edited volume in 2003. She's now editing another volume called Pain and Its Transformations, which reflects some of her really interesting work with medicine. She is also on the work of in the process of completing what will be a 4-volume systematic theology, the first volume of which has the title God, Sexuality, and the Self, an essay on the Trinity. And she also, from 2005-2008, is now co-directing with Martin Nowak of the Center of Evolutionary Dynamics a new $2 million research project called the Theology of Cooperation on theology, evolutionary biology, and game theory. And you all know her also as a much beloved and inspired teacher. So we're really happy to have you tonight on the topic of gender and desire. And there will be 2 responses after her talk, and then we'll open up the discussion.
Thank you so much, Janet, for a very gracious introduction. Well, I'm glad you advertised me as thinking aloud with you, because, in fact, I have decided to take a risk. I'm just in the process of writing the most tricky introductory part of my first volume of Systematics, which is precisely the part of the volume in which I am explaining why it is that systematic theology can go forward. There are many who doubt this, but at the same time how it cannot go forward credibly without taking the categories of desire and gender in a centrally significant way. And so I'm going to just talk through some of this with you and take a risk by being not fully developed, and then see what you ask me, because then I'll write it into the script. And if I look a little tired, it's because I'm writing references for about half the people in this room. So you've got to be nice to me tonight. And also, just a little plug. This book has just come out. I'm not sure, it may have a different cover in America, but it's a really good Christmas present for your parents who don't know about theologians. And it's called God's Advocates: Christian Thinkers in Conversation, edited by Rupert Short. And it tells you what arcane thinkers such as Jean-Luc Marion, Alvin Plantinga, Christoph Schwerbel, John Milbank, David Burrell, and Sarah Coakley say about themselves as theologians when caught in unguarded moments. So It's actually an interview format, which is delightful, I think. It works very well, and it's very accessible. And quite a lot of what I'm saying tonight appears in a very simple guise in that book. So what I'm going to do is this. I'll explain first the context in which I'm thinking about gender theory in its relation to desire. And that is in the context of what I see as the current regeneration of systematic theology, particularly in its intrinsic connection for me with the practices, the performances, if you like, of prayer, and especially the prayer of silence. And then I'm going to proceed to explicate my two main points. These are the sound bites. One, that we should look to the central doctrinal deposit or tenets or symbolisms of Christianity, Trinity and Incarnation, for the matrix for reflecting on gender as Christian theologians. A surprising move, rather than moving from secular gender theory and then using that, as it were, as a critical tool against the tradition. That's my first move. And secondly, that out of this emerges my particular distinctive view that, in a sense to be defined, desire is more fundamental than gender. It doesn't mean that gender is insignificant, it matters, but desire is more fundamental than gender. Under the first topic, I'll be giving an explication, that is, looking at the central deposit of doctrine to look for our notions of gender. I'll be giving an explication of the slightly different but connected arguments I have here about Trinity on the one hand and Incarnation on the other, that lead to my conclusion that gender is or should be, and we want to think about the conditions under which this occurs, gender is or should be rendered fluid or labile by submission to divine desire. And I'll look at the liturgically performative dimensions of the Eucharist's enactment of incarnational presence according to this rubric. I'll try en passant to clarify some definitions, which we all badly need to do at least once an hour in this area: desire, sex, gender, sexuality. And I'll also indicate how my thinking has, I think, some obvious and interesting connections with Freudian thought, with French feminisms, which obviously have been profoundly influenced by Freudian thought, and perhaps even more so with Judith Butler, but never in such a way as to make psychoanalytic or political thinking the primary tool over against the theological, but rather vice versa. So I'm turning the tables here and making this whole view of gender and desire robustly and centrally theological. I may end, if there's time, by indicating why I think that the line I'm taking has always been pressed to the edges of Christian acceptability. And I shall end with the twist that this particular line is more orthodox than orthodoxy. That it is so orthodox that it is very hard to accept. And it, in fact, is only seen as orthodox when practiced in this particularly demanding performative way. So that's the outline. And if I meander from my course, I will try to come back quickly. First then, by way of introduction, I want to draw your attention in some rather bold sweeps to a bifurcation or dialectic in the current theological scene vis-à-vis systematic theology on the one hand and feminist theologies on the other. Because if you're trying to be a feminist theologian and you also want to be a systematician, you're often regarded as an essentially oxymoronic being who possibly ought not to exist at all. Moronic in that sense. Because on the one hand, as I'm sure you have noticed, gender theory in its relationship to feminist theology up to now, if you're thinking from the 70s on, feminist theology has tended to take up the different waves of secular gender theory and then apply those fashions critically to the theological deposit or the Christian tradition, often almost like a sort of abusive bludgeoning tool, in fact, so that there's not much left of the Christian tradition after such applications have been made. And I don't need to go through these waves of fashion. And when I say they're fashions, I don't mean they're necessarily played out, because I think the necessity of continuing to think about equality, continuing to think about difference, continuing to think about justice, continuing to think about performativity and practical transformations. These are not over, but you probably get the signals of how they have indicated transformations in foremost American gender thinking. And most feminist theologians tend to think, in applying these particular brands of gender theory to the Christian tradition, that what they're doing is inimical to systematic theology, because they tend to think, as we'll see in a minute, of systematic theology as probably in tension with the critical feminist task that they've taken upon themselves. On the other hand, this is the other sort of side of the dialectic, systematic theology, fascinatingly and unexpectedly, you might say, given the conditions of postmodernity, is undergoing an extraordinary regeneration right now. There are more systematic theologians writing systematics, even in this country, and also in Germany, and indeed in England, which is, the Anglicanism has not traditionally done systematics, but there are more Anglicans writing systematics, and very good systematics too, than I can think of in the Anglican tradition. So there's a lot of systematic theology being done, but almost without any indication of the significance of gender theory and feminism. So it's as if these people are living in completely different realms, by and large. Feminist theologians who are suspicious of systematics, and regenerated systematicians who say little, if anything, about gender. There are some noble exceptions. And I take it that it is rather extraordinary that systematic theology is undergoing such a regeneration for three particular reasons. There are three, I think, cumulative and strong objections to systematic theology going forward in the postmodern era. One, that systematic theology tends to the danger and seductions of ontotheology, of imagining that it can sew up God, that it can describe or grasp or indicate what God is. Secondly, that's sort of Heideggerian critique of systematic theology. Secondly, that systematic theology is inherently hegemonic. Here you hear the Gramscian and Foucauldian kind of critique, that systematic theology, in giving an account of everything in a system, necessarily excludes voices who are pushed to the margin. And thirdly, here comes a particular kind of French feminist objection to systematics, that systematic theology is essentially phallocentric, that in its particular attempt at clarifying and analyzing and straightening everything out, it's essentially on the symbolic side of the Lacanian binary, and thus repressing the semiotic, the creative, unconscious dimension of the feminine. Now, my view, very quickly and simply, and I'll spell this out more if you want me to hear from me later, is that these three objections can be overcome almost simultaneously, and systematic theology repristinated in a way that makes it intrinsically connected with issues of desire and gender under the following conditions. I'll explain very briefly. Some of you have read me on this. That, first of all, if we define systematic theology not as totalizing, but rather as giving an account of how different pieces coherently fit together. Do you see the difference? It's not attempting to explain everything, but it's attempting to show how, if this is what your anthropology is, so this goes with this doctrine of God and this view of sin, etc., etc. Secondly, I think these problems can be overcome if systematic theology is itself systematically accountable to certain forms of practice. And in particular, what I have in mind here are the chastening and purgative practices, ascetical practices of contemplative prayer. Contemplative prayer, because its attention to silence is transformative in a number of ways. And these ways, I think, closely correlate to answering those three objections I've just mentioned. First of all, long-term practice of this sort. I'm not just a little taste for 10 minutes of a little bit of Palamite delight, but I'm talking about, 15 to 20 years. Practices of this sort, I think, train one in the asceticism of not attempting to describe God. These practices actually, first and foremost, remind you in a very visceral and significant way that the God you're relating to is not part of the furniture of the universe. Secondly, these practices train you how not to be hegemonic. In fact, I'm amazed how much people talk about how they're not going to be hegemonic and go on being hegemonic while they're doing it. You have to practice how to listen. You especially have to practice how to listen to another you don't want to hear about because they are threatening. So non-hegemonic behavior has to be practiced by silencing one's own thoughts, listening to other thoughts. And thirdly, the answer to the objection to that systematic theology is intrinsically phallocentric. This kind of practice you can't do for very long, not longer in my experience than about 3 minutes, without a flooding of erotic material out of the unconscious into a realm of at least subliminal consciousness. And therefore, intrinsically, such practices undertaken over the long haul require that the semiotic, to use the French feminist language, no longer be kept in a boundary separated from analytic thinking, but actually seep into and transform, destabilize, move, and take forward in unexpected and new directions what one is going to say. So this is a view of systematic theology that attempts to give an account of how its parts fit together. But because it's founded in and continually transformed by this particular kind of practice, it is at the same time always in via. It's always undoing itself in order to redo itself. It is always being frightened by but welcoming unwelcome messages from the semiotic realm. And it is always, therefore, having to negotiate what is the integrity of the erotic in relation to its statements about God. Right. Now, if you want a biblical passage that could possibly be anything to do with this, sometimes people say to me, did Jesus have this in mind? But if you want well, a lot of things he didn't have in mind, like, the magisterium. But if you want a very early passage in the New Testament that actually is talking about this, Romans 8 is my passage. We can come back and talk about this further, because it's a passage in the New Testament which Paul is talking about the interruption of the Holy Spirit, such that when we pray and find that we can't, because prayer is intrinsically impossible as a human art. It's always a relief to know that prayer is impossible, then you realize why you haven't been able to do it. When you then discover that it's actually done by the Holy Spirit, and that the Holy Spirit has visions for how it will be done which are not yours, then you see the whole undertaking of this kind of prayer is one in which the self is intrinsically being reformulated. Now, 2 points here, then, that I already indicated before I started. 2 questions. What if gender, given this introductory material, was construed not from some secular base or discussion, but as intrinsic to the doctrinal and systematic heritage of Christianity, perceived as rendered lively by this meditative, contemplative base? What if gender were, as it were, encoded in the central doctrines of Trinity and Incarnation, seen, moreover, not as extrinsic dogmatic tools of oppression, but as live, symbolic realms of engagement and transformation in the divine? And secondly, therefore, what if gender were seen as rendered labile to a more primary ontological flow of divine desire? So note here that, I'll come back to definitions at the end, but my view of desire in this title is first and foremost a ontological, metaphysical category. It's not an affect. It's not a nasty grasping of the sort that Nygren thought it was. It's not a merely biological urge, although it's certainly connected to biological urges and affects and desires that are particularly focused on particular items that seem to be desirable, or particular bodies that seem desirable. But first and foremost, in my view, desire is actually a property of the divine. It's just that in God, it does not signify lack. In God, it is that which is imprinted on the human soul as the precious clue of the source of the human soul's existence and the human soul's need to return home to that from which it came. Now, before I pass on into explicating very briefly how I see Trinity and Incarnation as rendering us some notion of gender, odd idea, just let me pause for a moment, because Amy was kind enough to show me late last night, we were both burning the midnight oil, what she had said last time. I was just off a plane from Belgium and fell over and really couldn't come. So she kindly sent me her notes. And before I pass on, let me just make a very friendly contrapuntal aside here about how I see all this connecting, but in a strangely inverse way, to what you were doing last time. Because it seems to me that the particular concerns that Amy brought up, which are not only her concerns, but the concerns of what I think are the most exciting debates in this country at the moment about gender, are A, that subjectivity and agency are a kind of irreducible and primary goal. This is in part a kind of Nachlass from Kant, but is being reworked in various ways. B, however, and this is often in tension with that first goal, that otherness, irreducible otherness, is what the self must be able to contend with without swallowing it up. So there is agency, but also otherness that have to be given an account of. C, that performativity or practice is precisely the place we should look to see how such agency and recognition of otherness, or lack of it, is given a visible form. And D, and this is a point of debate between Talal Saad and others at the moment, that the unconscious, or what Lacanians call the semiotic, is in some sense crucial in this negotiation of selfhood and recognition of otherness. Immediately, I think you'll see that all those concerns are ones that I am touching on with a particular theistic mode of approach. So what these four concerns don't have, as expressed secularly, is a presumption that I make from the start that God is the true source and goal of all our desires, and that it is in God and in and through reference to God that we will be able to answer these questions that are arising about agency, performativity, otherness, and the unconscious. And I was particularly taken by a poignant moment in Amy's talk where she said that gender and sexual norms are disabling, yet we cannot release ourselves. And my point would be, we surely can't release ourselves. Only God can release us. And that's why these particular practices of sui generis submission to divine desire are for me the only means whereby we are released. I think it's very poignant there at that point in her talk that Amy mentioned various practices within the Christian mystical tradition which seem to make a connection with these needs. And that this is where our thought, I think, converges, even though we start from such different ends of the line. Now, if I may, I'm going to move very briefly to try and explain to you how it could possibly be that Trinity and Incarnation provide the sort of symbolic clues to the nature of gender. And then I'll come at the end finally to pull the threads together and say what I give my final definitions of gender, desire, sex. How then can Trinity and Incarnation, not as extrinsic deposits of dogma, but as lived, practiced interactions with the divine, tell us what we need to know about gender and desire? Now, there are two prongs to this argument, and they are interestingly connected. The first is the Trinitarian piece, and the second is the incarnational piece. And this is complicated, and we can't avoid the complication, because we're dealing with three levels or types of relationship. we're dealing with relationship between God and God in the ontological Trinity, so-called. So perfect relationship in God, three persons in one God. Then secondly, we're dealing with how God relates to the human across the primary difference, that is between the divine, the infinite qualitative difference between the divine and the human. And this is the realm both of the economic Trinity, the Trinity as it reaches out to us and transforms us, and also of the Incarnation, the second person of the Trinity taking flesh and transforming it. And then thirdly, we have whatever this means at these previous two levels for our relations between humans. And whereas the secular discussion that I've just alluded back to is restricted, you might say, to the human-human, I'm trying to add these other two layers of reflection about relationships. So let's start with the God-God level at the beginning. God-God-God level, I should say, the Trinity. And what I want to argue here is that there is an irreducible threeness in God that signals there is no perfect relationship without threeness. And the Spirit is utterly crucial here, traditionally relegated to the third, but for my thinking, necessarily a primary emphasis. Because if relegated to third and becoming merely the sort of feminine adjunct to an established all-male patriarchal household, as you get in a lot of medieval representations of the Trinity, then all is lost before you begin. This is not a Trinity in which gender is encoded by some kind of compensation of little bits of femininity put in for good measure where masculinity was dominant. I'm afraid that's rather how I see Elizabeth Johnson as going. This is wipe Elizabeth Johnson from your mind. It's nothing to do with that. Forget everything I ever said about Elizabeth Johnson. Right. Because the threeness of perfect relationship is always in danger of being reduced back to two. And when it's reduced back to two, you get, as it were, a supposed perfect model of relationship in God, which is actually a kind of model for homoerotic narcissism. You get the Father and the Son eyeball to eyeball, as Mary Daly, memorably put it years ago, admiring each other, and then, as Mary Daly also said in another passage, congratulations, women, you belong to the Holy Spirit. He's feminine. She's wonderful. I mean, she got it all right in some wonderful ways. But what I'm saying here is that, and this is tricky, but the irreducible donum that the Spirit is, the gift, as Augustine called the Spirit in the 15th book of the De Trinitate, is that which both binds and breaks apart the dyad of Father-Son. This third is really first, because it's what makes possible an equality in distinction. So compare here, biblically, the Father-Son relationship of John's Gospel, which I think has actually inspired a great deal of what I call this primary homoerotic narcissism. And the Spirit is added on only as that which comes after and reminds you about that relationship. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a vision of the Trinity in which the irreducible third is that which makes possible perfect relationship. So for me, the very fact that God in Trinity is irreducibly three tells us what perfect relationship should be, and tells us that gender at the human level, whatever it is, can't be fixed and static as two. There's the symbolism that disallows that fixity, which I would say is actually a perversion, an already, if a subordinated femininity to a primary masculinity is already, as it were, a fallen state. It already doesn't manifest the image of God that we see in the Trinitarian God. All right. So the Trinity is not what Irigaray once put it beautifully, an ego-logical dualism. The Trinity is the Spirit irreducibly demanding that perfect relationship must be at least 3. And that even in the love between the Father and the Son, there is a sense in which their love might swallow each other up were it not for that which protects the distinctiveness of each and at the same time binds them together. Now, if this is so, then what does this tell us, secondly, about the implications of the Incarnation for gender? Strictly speaking, as we now see, Incarnation only comes about because of the Spirit's interruption. Think of the Annunciation story. Think again of Romans 8. It is because the Spirit, as it were, cracks open the possibilities of the human heart and renders the existence of a God-man possible that the Incarnation can occur. Why does this too, as I see it, destabilize a fixed view of the gender binary? Because, again as I see it, what's happening in the Incarnation is an age-old tendency to gender God as masculine and humanity as feminine being overcome, disturbed. The masculine has mingled with the feminine, has queered the pitch, you might say, of a duality that was previously assumed to be total between the divine and the human. And my particular arguments about the Incarnation here, and it involves a particular reading of Ephesians 5, which we can come back to later because it's certainly not the standard reading, only became clear to me when I became a priest. And this is where the performative dimensions of the liturgical enactment of doctrine is, I think, peculiarly interesting. Because, just a little autobiographical aside here, I was ordained into a parish in Oxford because John Henry Newman built it. It has an east fixed altar. The altar cannot be brought out. So you have to celebrate east facing. And as I celebrated for the first time east facing, I suddenly realized that what the priest's body does in celebrating east facing is, as it were, stand for the people when raising the gifts up to God, and then turning round and standing on behalf of Christ and blessing them and absolving them and giving them communion. So there's this labile movement of the body of the priest in which the priest is actually crossing over from the divine and the human all the time. Now, given the redolent traditional binary of the people as in persona Mariae or ecclesiae, the people as feminine and the priest as, or Christ as masculine, and yet Christ already is destabilizing that because Christ has precisely in the Incarnation moved over from the divine side into the human side. The priest is stepping across this line constantly. It's like a ritual of reversal. And when I started trying this out on priestly friends whom I knew, all the gay ones said, of course, yes, of course, we always knew that. And all the straight ones said, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. If I ever thought that, I would have repressed it immediately. But my view is this, that actually now we have women priests, the cat's out of the bag, so that what previously could have been a ritual of reversal like Mardi Gras that you just did in the course of the Eucharist and then put everything back in its place, is now actually becoming manifest as a transformative dimension of the Incarnation as liturgically enacted. So that's how I came to this conclusion. And because practices, especially liturgical and prayer practices, mobilize the unconscious in such an extraordinary way, such a powerful way, it's really crucial here that we don't just look at these doctrinal deposits as static, but that we're thinking of them as enacted and of the potential for their, as it were, rendering labile a supposed fixity of the binary of the male-female. Now, what then do I mean, this is my last paragraph, when I say that this model of gender becomes labile to divine desire? What I do not mean to say here is that several things that you're probably familiar with, and it's very unfortunate, I think, that feminist theology of the 70s and 80s, and then to some extent late antiquity studies of more recently, have tended to create certain boxes into which you can put gender. So you can say, for instance, that some ascetical women become honorary males, or you can say that, as Rosemary Rupert misread Gregory of Nyssa, you can say that Gregory of Nyssa thought that gender didn't matter, that you could transcend it, And I'm saying, of course gender matters, because it's all that we have in a way. Gender is about our embodied relationships. That's what I take gender to be. But as much as it matters, it's also transformable. In fact, it's always in via. We're always negotiating what the world wants us to be and what God wants us to be. And if we attend to what God wants to be, it's my view that what God wants is for us to reflect divine desire. And if we reflect divine desire as God wants it, then, to judge by some of the zaniest dimensions of mystical theologians in the past, that will not involve being able to be fixed in what the world's view of gender is. So what we're aiming for is an escape from societal stereotype, not into performative transgression or new agency or some of these other secular words, but what I think Paul truly meant by the glorious liberty of the children of God. The glorious liberty. That's not libertarianism, but it's the making free because precisely it is submissive to the only persons that one should be submissive to, the persons of the Trinity. So let me end with summing up what I think my definitions are here, which are, by the way, provisional. I quite like some help on this. As I've said, I take gender to be the embodied means of our relationships, which matter because they are embodied, but which are not fixed. And I take sex to be our bodily and chromosomal and gonadal shape or type, which still has to be seen as, in some sense, distinct from gender, even though not distinct in the way that people thought in the 70s, that it would be nice if you could keep them distinct, because otherwise we can't explain why it is that some people so profoundly feel that the sex they have doesn't relate to the gender they have. If it weren't for that discomfort, we probably could do away with these two categories. And desire I take to be, and this is where I'm bound to be misheard, because we are so affected in our culture by a kind of debased Freudianism. But desire I take to be an ontological, metaphysical category, which then, when rendered to us by God, and when attended to us epistemologically through the practices of prayer, sets us on a whole lifetimes of ascetical transformation, of purifying, transforming, redirecting and rightly directing our desires, so that over a lifetime I can see that my desperately wanting a stiff drink or an ice cream is not in the same category as my though I do desperately want a stiff drink, but it's not in the same, quite in the same category as my desire to be faithful to my partner, which is not in quite the same category, though it has to be very carefully sorted with my desire to go to bed with that extremely attractive person I've just met at a party, which in turn has to be measured against my desire, finally, for God, who is the true and only desirable one. So you can see here, I think, that psychological, psychoanalytic, philosophical and political categories are not basic in this matter. For me, theological categories must be basic, which doesn't mean that I don't think it follows from that one has interesting and creative things to say to the philosophical, psychoanalytic and political discussions. In fact, one needs to say such things. If you ask finally why it is that this hasn't been more obvious up to now, if this is so obvious to me, why has it not been clearer? And I would answer that it has been clear to a lot of people, but they've never been mainstream, and there are very profound political reasons for that. Because this view of gender is very inconvenient. It's very inconvenient for a society that wishes to keep women in their place. It's very inconvenient for a view of society which would like there not to be any homosexuality. It's very inconvenient for a society that doesn't want to know about people whose gender changes. It's very inconvenient for a view of society which wants dogmas to be obvious and given and non-confusing and absolutely clear and direct and not involving profoundest transformations of the most painful and lifelong sort, without which we cannot go where I think we have to go. So there are people in the tradition that both Amy and I work on who I think have seen some of this, but they have usually been pushed to the margins. But I would want to claim, and this is my parting shot, that ultimately they are more orthodox than the orthodox, because they have actually perceived the depth and the power and the pain and the transformation involved if these doctrines are taken as they finally have to be taken in order for us to come home to God.
You want me to sit here or
No,
stand? Partridge. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in Religion, Gender, and Culture program. Thank you, Professor Coakley, for that really rich, dense talk, and you've given us a lot to ponder. And I know that the questions that I raise are just a few that are sort of the tip of the iceberg of so much more that you can elaborate for us, hopefully, in the in our questions afterwards, but also just in the years to come. I'm particularly intrigued by your statement that desire is more fundamental than gender, and I have to say I actually think I might agree with you. I've been I've been thinking about this. We've been in conversation about this for years, and
actually. You've influenced me, right?
And you me too.
This person understands the liturgical.
Oh, thanks. And I have thoughts about the liturgical piece too. And I do think I actually think I have the same definition of gender that you articulated. That gender is embodied desire, essentially. My one question I have regarding desire is how do you see it as related to sexuality? I noticed that particular term didn't come up for you, but it is in the title of your first book of systematics, God, Sexuality, and the Self. So, would you prefer that it were God, desire, and the self? Interesting. Okay, so I'd love to hear more about it, about how you understand sexuality and how it does not overlap with desire, assuming that there is any overlap with desire in your view. Another thing that was interesting to me that I'd like to hear more about has to do with the boundary line between the secular and the theological. I hear you saying that you're trying to do something quite different from what feminist theologians have done for a generation now, taking feminist and gender theory and using it to look at theology and sort of figure out how to approach theology as a result. And you're sort of, in a way, going the other way around, or as I understood you. And my question is, where do you locate sort of the boundary between those two things? Like, I know that I'm not so sure that my reading of feminist and gender theory isn't often inflected by my having been formed growing up in the Christian tradition. So I understand that impulse on your part. But I also know that I don't think I could definitely say that when I'm being purely impacted by theology as opposed to gender theory. And so I'm not quite sure often where I might even locate the secular as opposed to the theological or the church. So I'd be curious to hear more how, because you seem to draw a pretty rigid line there. So I'm curious to hear more about that. I'm allowed. I had many questions, but I don't want to take up too much time. Yes. In the liturgical, I find actually I'm also an Episcopal priest, and I recently have had the experience of liturgical east-facing, which is not something that I've had the experience of doing before. So actually this season in the parish where I serve, we're doing that. And I'm probably the only non-gay man who totally knew what you were talking about. I don't know. Definitely queer, but anyway, there's a whole story there that I won't go into. But I definitely understand that gender is definitely being navigated and rendered, shown to be labile in liturgy in ways that have not nearly been paid attention to enough, and I'm really glad that you raised that. I'm curious how, because you mentioned Butler, and this may be more sort of arcane and needs to be gotten into here, but Butler and performativity, it seems like you're applying that to liturgy, and I'm curious about how you kind of see agency happening in liturgy, because agency in Butler is highly bounded. It always we're negotiating in a situation of constraint. We're not truly sort of autonomous, free beings. And certainly, I think the application of performativity to Butler makes a lot of sense, because, among other things, liturgy is, for those of us in traditions that have certain requirements about how we're able to function liturgically, it is a scene of constraint also. So in any case, I just wanted to raise that and suggest that would be interesting to hear more about, or just to say that was a comment that I had in response. And also, what happens to the agency of the one who's praying? Clearly they're being transformed, so clearly there's not a full autonomy going on in the praying too, and it'd be interesting to hear more about that. And I'm not saying that I think that the total free autonomous is the end all be all either. Actually, I don't. So, but I'm curious to hear more about that. About the Trinity, I would love to hear more about how the language of persons works. You have the three persons, and the Spirit sounded to me like the Spirit functions as a mode that prevents the Father and the Son from swallowing each other up. So how is the Spirit a mode and one of three persons? Like, sort of, how did that distinction of the three persons kind of work with that?
It has to be verbal.
Oh, okay. Yeah. In any case, I think I just wasn't completely understanding on that one. So there's so much more, but I don't want to take up more time and let Bob continue on. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
You let me know if this doesn't work. My name's Bob Davis. I'm a second year MDiv here. Also, I guess I want to start with the first claim you made about the reinvigoration of systematic theology in the debate, because I have to admit that I can't decide quite what to make of it for myself. To make systematic theology the source of and not the object of critique of these contemporary debates about gender. On the one hand, as I think about my own relation to these debates and my thoughts, it has been not the theologians, but the secular gender theorists like Judith Butler who have allowed me to reapproach the tradition in a new way, to form new questions for it. And I do think that this ongoing encounter, at least for me, the two-way conversation between Christian theology and contemporary feminist theory is crucial if one wants to gain new insights into both and not just kind of devolve into a battle between them. And like Cameron, I see that also maybe the distinction is not so clear. Interesting to think about. The Christian faith has always drawn insight from strains of thought outside of the church, and this particular area seems to me to be one where we could use all the help we could get. But on the other hand, in my own conversations with Christians who are uneasy about homosexuality and gender subversion, I'm struck by the fact that their concerns are usually based less on a serious knowledge of the Bible or theological traditions than on pseudoscientific observations about the natural order or even the animal kingdom. And I guess that's surprisingly often. Right. A kind of moralized or simplistic narrative of evolutionary biology that they don't really understand, but that gets employed nevertheless. These conversations make me realize the value of what I hear you saying, that what is missing from Christian debates on gender and sexuality most often is a real serious engagement with Christian doctrines themselves. Of course, this faith in the natural order has a theological claim attached to it, that the God who created the world also sanctions it the way it is, or always has been. I'm especially thinking of recent church pronouncements that define homosexual orientation not just as a sin against God, but as an aberration of nature. In light of this, it seems that for any theological formulation of gender and sexuality to have currency, it has to engage not only the symbolic matrix of gender, but also explicitly take up this category of the natural, or even the biological, and try to explain how that which we perceive in nature relates to the category of revelation in word and sacrament. How do we reconcile the God who created the male and female to the one who calls us out of these categories, as you say? So I guess my question, how does the fluidity of the symbolic gender matrix revealed in Christ and the triune God affect the way we think about the kinds of bodies we have and the sexual markings they bear? It seems to me that maybe the Incarnation, as the encounter between word and flesh, may offer a point of entry for critiquing assumptions about the immutability of bodily sexual difference and the biological significance of sex. I want to hear what you think about that. And do you think this liturgical and cosmological fluidity of gender leads to a denaturalizing of bodily sexual difference? And by that I don't mean effacement. And if it does, then how do you understand the significance of the kinds of bodies we have for the ways in which we orient our desires? How, in light of what you've just laid out, do we read the marks of bodily sexual difference? And do they represent any sort of limit to gender fluidity that you've just talked about? Thank you.
What's the name of the game here?
Why don't you respond? And do you want to field questions after that, or would you like me to do that? So
Yeah, maybe you should field them.
okay. So maybe a brief response, and then we can have a
Time's on. How do I define sexuality? I wouldn't mind some help on this. But one of the reasons I'm nervous about the term sexuality is that it really does have different overtones in America and England. And this is why I'm beginning to regret having it in the title of my book. That it was Cambridge University Press insisted that it would be in there and it would sell lots of copies, although my husband thought it ought to be renamed God, Sex and the Royal Family. Was it gardening, sex and the Royal Family? That's for the English market, right? Christmas book. But anyway, because I think the difference, just colloquially, between England and America is that sexuality in America normally has the overtones of enacted sex, whereas in England it doesn't. It has more the overtones of orientation, of desire. Now, for me, sexuality does have overlap with desire. It's that the desire is the more generic category, which has both a divine ontological meaning and then a secondary human epistemological meaning. Right. And sexuality refers to one sort of desire, physical, sexual desire, which also, though, has strong emotional components, can't be said to be merely physical, which I see to be actually the most powerful biological means by which God reminds us that God is our creator. Now, I haven't mentioned the symposium, but I'm sure those of you who know the symposium realize how much the symposium is playing in the background of what I'm saying, because there's really everything you need, in a way, for my theory, if you put together the symposium with the New Testament. And it was precisely that marriage that occurred initially around the 3rd century, the end of the 2nd century, the 3rd century, out of which I'm speaking. This is nothing very new, actually, that I'm saying. It's just it's been forgotten. And so I take sexuality to be a particular subset of desire, if that helps. Then you talked about, yes, the boundary between the secular and theological. Of course, I'm being rhetorically naughty here, because and this answers one of Bob's questions as well, I think your first one, that there is a hermeneutic circle here, clearly, that in coming up with this particular way of saying what I want to say, which has deep historic connections to the Song of Songs tradition in Christianity, starting with Origen and my great hero, Gregory of Nyssa, and then moving through to my other great hero, John of the Cross, whom I didn't talk of, but really this whole theory of the purgation and transformation of desire is a San Juanist one, is clearly, it's being brought alive in a fresh way for me by reading Butler and the whole crew. And so there is a sense in which I come to this material with those questions in mind, but then I see that when I go back to my Christian heritage here, I transmute the question. All right. And so I'm perfectly happy to repent me of my rhetorical disjunct. But it does get people's attention, you have to admit. You sort of wake up after dinner when you hear this. Thirdly, liturgy. I think there's so much more to be done here. I mean, I just had no idea how much there is to be done. Any more doctoral theses? Because I am indeed, again, deliberately linking into all that you know about performativity in the Butlerian sphere. But I think there's something different about liturgy and performative forms of transgression, however delicious. Because, as Nussbaum naughtily said against Butler, it's so delicious to do this because it leaves everything actually as it is. There's a sort of deep pessimism in Butler that there will be a truly profound societal change effected. But you see, my view is that the Incarnation is a cosmological disturbance, and that in liturgy we step into and make our own that transforming, liberating cosmological disturbance. Now, we can do it badly, and it won't work at all. We can pick our noses, think about what we're having for dinner, slop through it. I mean, how you perform liturgy makes all the difference to how transformative it is. And I'm not saying that merely, I hope I'm not sounding Pelagian here, because liturgy, when done well, is always and precisely a request for the Spirit to do the Spirit's epicletic work of breakage, for the Spirit to come in and disturb us again. I mean, when I break the bread and hold it up, I've just broken the world apart again. And it's in that space that incarnational reality can come forth and is present. So to think about this in conversation with Butler is, I think, very interesting, because for her, we are always constrained, even in our performative transgression. And what I'm saying is, liturgy constrains us in a freeing way, because it's precisely the rules of liturgy that allow us to do this particular sui generis divine form of freeing. And then what happens to the one who is praying and the one who's liturgically been transformed? Is this a full autonomy? Down with autonomy. I'm not interested in autonomy. This is the great hunting of the snark of the modern period. It doesn't exist, and it's a secular aberration if it did exist. What I'm interested in is the true freedom that comes through the right form of submission. And this is not a new idea either. I mean, it's Augustinian, it's Calvinist, it's Thomistic, but it has to be given new freightage and new reality in each generation, rhetorically brought alive. How is the language of three persons working? Is the Spirit functioning as a mode? Now, I'll let you into a nasty little secret, and don't report me to the bishop. I actually think that the hypostasis of the pneuma, the hypostasis of the Spirit, can't be thought about in exactly the same way as the hypostasis of the Father and the Son. That there is something specific to the Spirit's activity as donum, as gift, as love, which shouldn't be personalizable in the same way, but is precisely its specificity as relationship, which resides in this new way that I'm glossing the filioque. So actually, this would be an enormously lengthy sideline, which I don't want to go into tonight. But I'm actually defending the filioque in a new sense, but I'm saying that I want to say that it's fully alignable with the way that I read the Cappadocian tradition of the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father through the Son. So I'm attempting to solve here with my new lenses of gender and so on, a whole lot of ancient doctrinal bag and baggage, but I have to make a few nifty moves, which I think I won't go into right now. And then finally, coming back to a couple of other Bob's questions, the reinvigoration of systematic theology. What were you asking me there, Bob? That was your first question. Can systematics be the source of it's really the same question as the secular theological one, is it?
Right. It's just there's not really a question.
Okay. All right.
It's that question again.
Is that question again? Yeah. And so I really want to admit that secular theorists have helped me enormously and stimulated me enormously, but they've made me think afresh about the richness of the theological tradition here. And then the natural and the biological. Yeah, this is hugely significant because at the moment in our culture wars about homosexuality, which are absolutely dividing whole church bodies as well as our culture, the rhetoric of the natural is actually not being looked into as critically as it ought to be. I mean, the notion of the natural is non-obvious at all, and I'm becoming more aware of that as I get into conversations with evolutionary biologists than ever before, actually. So I'm not arguing here for any kind of effacement of difference, but I am arguing for the intense pluriformity of variations of bodies and desires and attractions, which I think actually are manifested in nature. I mean, the appeal to the plumbing, as if that was the end of the conversation about homosexuality, is, I think, very peculiar indeed, and doesn't actually tie in with practices as actually practiced in any culture that you look at in any detail and under the bedclothes. This is not, however, a call for me to try out all kinds of previously condoned pleasures. This is where I'm really very far from having the same interests as Judith Butler, because I precisely want to go beyond the false disjunct between repression and libertarianism. Again, that's a sort of modernistic disjunct, as if you had to choose. Either you're going to be repressed, or you're going to let it all hang out and have as many pleasures and of whatever sorts as you wish to have. I'm precisely actually putting the kibosh on that latter by saying that the serious spiritual course here is that of thinking about how all your desires, in all their triviality and all their significance, have to be put into some kind of order, by which I don't mean repressing some of them. I mean having them find their right place in relationship to what really matters, which at the end of the day is our desire for God. I think that's a very, very hard thing to be heard in our particular culture, for all its God talk. Okay, I think that's enough.
Lots of questions. So I encourage your questions, and also if you two commentators who both did such a great job, also want to just chime in as well and sort of continue to answer on for the same. That would be good too. So any questions? And Amy, why don't you go ahead and since your work was referred to.
Well, no, I don't want to talk about that part. This is really wonderful, Sarah. Really, my brain is flying into places. So I have a lot of things. It's too tired. Yeah, I'm too tired. But anyway, the one thing I want to ask you about, and I think it may have been lurking behind at least something that Bob said, I'm not sure. If you let desire lead and see desire as primary, which I'm all with you there on all sorts of levels. And also let the Trinity lead as the Spirit, the Spirit leading the Trinity as that which is disruptive of this dyadic structure, and with the dyadic, disruptive, as you said, of any gender dyad. The thing I keep wondering about is whether, and I'm thinking about the sort of parts of the tradition that I've worked with, and despite the fact that within the tradition, Christian traditions, we see places in which that fluidity of gender is really sparked by precisely the desire for a God that is radically other and irreducible to masculine and feminine. My worry is that what we generally end up reinscribing, with very few exceptions, is some kind of fluidity between masculine and feminine, so that the gender dyad of masculine and feminine constantly gets reinscribed. And it's that issue you were asking about the Spirit. I mean, when you were talking about the Spirit, you said, I don't want Mary Daly's, everybody be happy, the Holy Spirit's, he's a woman, you know what I mean? How do we get the Spirit as the third not to be a sort of, reinscription of the dyad of masculine and femininity, and to be something that will really disrupt that very twofold notion of what embodied desire can look like?
I know. That is such a... I utterly agree with you, and I was struggling with this at the end of the article I wrote about the liturgical performance.
Okay. Yeah.
And the fact is, it almost always goes wrong.
Yeah.
All right, let me say that.
Yeah.
Because the tug back to the world's view of gender is so profound that trying to, I'm not for a minute denying that usually this does go wrong. So what are the conditions under which it doesn't go wrong? And
what is it like when it doesn't go wrong?
What's it like?
And that's what we have to imagine or find somebody who has it.
It's a taste of the glorious liberty of the children of God.
I don't know,
but I do think, and I haven't worked this out yet, all right, so you can help me, but I do think that the very key here is the negotiation of the unconscious. And that attention to the way that the unconscious transforms, fuels, disturbs the practices of silent prayer, and particularly the liturgical modulations of that prayer. Because I don't see the liturgical and the private prayer as being disjoint. I see the liturgy as a manifestation of this Trinitarian undertaking into which we stay. And then when we do it privately, it's just an extension of that, because this private prayer actually is implicitly an ecclesial act. So it's I think we're actually on the sort of dawn of a new set of consciousnesses around this. This is really a breakthrough, and I think it is connected with women becoming priests, actually, because male priests, I think, have always done this, but then colluded in its stopping at the end of the liturgy. So that the question is, how do you extend it outside of the liturgy so that the cosmological disturbance that you do in the liturgy is also then transforming the life of the world? And I can't get any further than this at the moment, but I entirely see the problem, and this is what I want to extend further. In fact, it's going to come up in both the second and the third volume of the Systematic. The second volume, in which I look in detail at the epistemology of these transformations, and why it is absolutely necessary that the mind be darkened, that there is a sort of radical negation of everything you thought you knew in order for this liberty to emerge, which is incredibly painful. Because otherwise you will keep just putting everything back in place. And then the third volume is about how that could possibly extend into public institutions of healing and of punishment. So, how does this work in relationship to how society keeps order and transforms people in prison and hospital? That's what I'm really interested in now. But by the way, I deal with race in the second volume because I see race as part of this. I see race for white people as an epistemic problem, as being unable to see blackness as that which must be welcomed in order for a society to be transformed. So what's happening in the prayer of divine darkness is also a transformation of our perception of how race goes. And indeed, I think it's not this is very Constantinian, it's not insignificant that Kant and others created the modern category of race precisely at the moment that the Dionysian tradition of transformative darkness was transmuted into something called the luminal, which would become a sort of no man's land, which you couldn't use as something that transformed. So it's a very you get the idea.
Anyone else on that particular point? That seems to be really important. Or other questions?
I do have a question on that. Yeah. I think I'm struck by in your answer, I guess, that about the part of your talk where the prayer and the kind of, you didn't use this language, loss of self. I can't remember how you just did the darkness. Prayer and the liturgical act performance are the two places that you go to think of
how you might do
response to Amy's question. And I guess it made me think, why not intimate relationships? In other words, it seems to me as you were talking that we are constantly experiencing the disruption of those boxes or the inadequacy of those categories in the difficulties involved in negotiating with another person, with whom we are close enough that we cannot, in fact, because mostly relationships do, in fact, go along with those categories that we set up. We set up those role playing, and that's what works well, and that's how we do and need to do most relationships to save time. But in intimate relationships, we don't and can't usually rely on that so easily. So
why am I going there? Because to go back to my 3 levels of relationship, do you remember I said the divine, human, and human. I can't find simply in an analysis of the human the resources I need to see how this could be changed. That's the starting point of the whole thing.
Because that's the challenge that your way of thinking about it poses to Amy's, right?
Yes, it does.
Amy, when you went to Christian practices, and the question for you of where God is and all that is held us to the side. It doesn't. The Christian practices don't have to necessarily be in relation to God. It's that the Christianity is one place. Religious traditions is where those kinds of practices, those self-transformative practices.
Right. But you see, then for me, they're not self-transformative practices. They're divine self-transformative practices.
But I mean, there's a whole. I mean, the only counter thing I would say to that is that there are. I mean, the Christian practices of cultivation of sort of kind of self. Have analogs within other traditions in which they're not divinely oriented. So I would just put it under that broader.
Absolutely, and I think there haven't been any Buddhist voices yet, but I think there are some very obvious points of parallel to claims that might be made on the basis of Buddhist meditation on a long haul about erotic transformation. Would you say?
Yes. No, there's a lot that one could say. I guess I'm caught before I get into the Buddhist those things. I'm not sure that would be more specifics about what happens in silence and meditation, and I would like to pursue that, but even before, I'm not sure that we necessarily, though, have to go there. Is there something about the mediation itself, or the thirdness, that is so central for you that liturgy makes possible?
Yeah.
There's something, and which of course is what you were thematizing anyway. It seemed to me that the central point, which I actually didn't exactly follow, because I'm really slow about a lot of things, I didn't exactly follow, but the moment when you're turning, or that really, dramatic moment when you're both, being God to the audience, and then you're being the audience towards God, and you as that mediator who can go in both directions, seems to be a very, very central place for you.
Right. And the spirit is crucial here because of what I see as the Spirit's distinctive activity in the liturgy as interrupter. I use the word epiclesis, which is the point at which the calling in of the Spirit to transform the gifts. I'm reading as a calling in to break our existing restrictive categories, to transform our desires, to remake our desires, and to precisely not leave everything as it is.
But that alternation that you're talking about was more related to how you read the Incarnation.
Exactly.
Not the thirdness isn't so much operative in that alternation that you're talking about.
Well, actually, it is implicitly, because up to now I've had these two arguments, one about Trinity and one about Incarnation, and they haven't been very well welded. But I now see they actually are connected, because it's only in virtue of the Spirit that the Incarnation can occur.
Right.
It's in virtue of the interruption of the Annunciation, a very inconvenient interruption. You don't get it. I'm sorry.
No, I do get it. It's just that I have a lot to think about, and I wanted to.
It doesn't transmute easily into Buddhism.
No, it does. It does. I just don't. I don't actually. I sort of want to get the principle even before going to thinking about. There's lots of stuff I would say from Buddhism, but that's for further discussion. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question that may be muted some by your neo-heresy about the Trinity there. But given your reference to Romans 8, does the indwelling of the very Spirit of God in some sense satiate this desire of the believer for God? And how does that particularly relate to the liturgical bit if you put it under pressure of the ministry of all believers, both male and female?
I may have to come up and ask you quite what you meant by the second part, but doesn't satiate. No, I would say that the Spirit's interruption both intensifies and transforms desire, but doesn't dampen or satiate it. Here I'm enormously affected by Gregory Nyssa, that perfection, Christian perfection for him is never arriving, because that desire is ever ongoing. Because the one object of desire who is truly desirable and worthy of our desire is God, who is by definition ungraspable by human categories. So desire never comes to an end. Intimacy is available. Transformation, purgation. The priesthood of all believers, very good question. Is it only the priest having a wonderful time up there, flipping desires and so on? I mean, it doesn't feel wonderful most of the time, I have to say. But what it does, what really happens here, and I'm only becoming conscious of this after a few years as a priest. So really, no one talks about this. It's really interesting. Being a desired object as a priest. You are a very desirable object the minute you're a priest. Even if you're as ugly as sin. Very, very sexy.
I'm glad we got that part that's probably a really key point.
It is. And so you are inducing desire from people, but you are a representative figure. And therefore it isn't actually that you are separate from the people. It's not they're not in it and you are. That's one of the very interesting features of this, that you are acting representatively on behalf of them and also on behalf of Christ, and together you make up Christ's body, which is sort of erotically re-knit into to each other every time this cosmological disturbance occurs. So I know this can sound like a sort of priestcraft. It's especially to someone of your good tradition, which I revere. But it's not intended. Some other questions? Yes.
I have a question about the role of purgation and asceticism and the role of silent prayer, and particularly when you're talking about how asceticism and silent prayer can overcome these three moments of skepticism. This is about systematic theology, ontotheology, the inherently hegemonic nature of theology, and then phallocentrism. So my question there is, given to the extent that systematic theology is located within the academic community, and to the extent to which the academic community perhaps militates against mystical prayer or mystical life, do you see, how would you kind of resolve that tension? Or would you see that perhaps the contemplative way could transform the very way we do theology?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. I left out a whole lot here that is in the introduction to the book. You see, I don't see systematic theology as an intrinsically academic undertaking. In fact, I call my method theology totale, with some, I don't mean totalizing, but with deliberate allusions to the Annales school of historiography, l'histoire totale. Because systematic theology, to be truly systematic, has not only got to show how the pieces fit together, but it's also got to show how what it's proposing permeates every level of life. So I'm proposing a view of systematic theology which is actually, it's not new. It goes back to people like Evagrius, who will say in his De Ratione that the one who truly prays is a theologian, and the theologian is the one who truly prays. So that's what a theologian is, and it also means that for that theologian, nothing is alien to this theologian. So each volume of my systematics has one chapter in which I test how this proposal works out in a very kind of earthy way through field work. I've actually done field work on the Doctrine of the Trinity.
Just human subjects of
He doesn't need it. So absolutely, what you're picking up is that this involves a very revolutionary in some ways, but in other ways a very ancient view of how the very task of theology is itself an ascetical task. It's not something you can do for fun, at school and get A's or B's for. It's a life's work.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Coakley. We met about a year ago, precisely this time, and I see some of the things that we discussed. Even though we had 30 minutes, it was the best 30 minutes I'd spent in a year. So I thank you for it. I want to comment that much of what you said, about, especially around the liturgy and practices, that seems going on today in Pentecostalism, especially in the Third World. And also another phenomenon, we have men who change their worship style so that in effect it's feminine. And there's no issue about that. There's no controversy, it just does. So I just want to leave that with you as something you may want to investigate as you go through your 4 volumes. The Pentecostals might be worth looking at because they may be doing some of the things we're already talking about. Now I have 3 questions, briefly. The first, what happens to Thomism and the natural theology of Thomism in your system? Does it go away forever?
Just 3 questions.
No, I'm just
questions,
I'm just asking you. You don't have to ask me. I'm just interested to see where is it going to fit in or anywhere it's just get kicked out or what happens to it. And the other question is, Paul talks about there's no male or female in Christ Jesus, which some people take as an eschatological statement. Do you think these problems that you describe are solvable in this situation, or are we basically having to kind of live with a lot of the oppressions that we have put upon each other until we get to the eschaton?
Perhaps I can answer the latter one first. I think the great crisis of our very religious culture here, I do see the resurgence of fundamentalism as being sort of strange underbelly of extreme secularism in Northern Europe. They're sort of curiously related. And what's evading us here is what I hope not in any way superciliously call grown-up religion. I mean, the reason that the mystical theological path has always been so difficult is because it's so difficult. It is really hard. It really involves constantly re-examining one's categories, constantly being willing to change, constantly being in states of real darkness because of that transformation, because of it. And it's only if one's willing to go through these kinds of processes, it seems to me, that something of that eschatological vision will be available here. The question is, are our ecclesiastical institutions capable of these kinds of transformations? And I really don't know. I mean, this is the argument I have with David Martin at the AAR, because he tends to have a sort of perennial sociological view of religion as always, boxing and coxing between the church and the sect being pure, the church being corrupt, both ultimately being corrupt in his view in their different ways. And the question is, what about the mystic? Is the mystic ever going to be able to transform these institutions? I don't know the answer, but I hope that it can be done. Thomism and natural theology. Very good question and a big one. I think broadly I am a sort of, in the last 10 years I've just become more and more transfixed by Thomas and by the richness of his thinking. And I would describe myself as a kind of Thomist, actually, in my approach. But I don't read his natural as sort of a static given, which then doesn't need either completing by revelation, which he explicitly says, or incapable itself of having labile features to see. And this is a delicate point on how you read the second part of the sermon. But I don't read it myself in the way that certain rigid scholastic views of the natural have been read, to answer your question about nature. But that would take a great long excursus.
I feel called upon to make some Buddhist comment.
Yes.
And as the discussion goes, just one very brief point would be, at least on the analog of certain practices, such as the silence that you talked about, which of course are very familiar to Buddhist kinds of practices. For me, it goes back to Connie's question also, that one of the goals in Buddhist sort of appropriation of what you get out of silence is to engage it in everyday activity, and so that it's not only located in these moments of defined silence, but from the Buddhist doctrine, let's say, of emptiness, that in fact it's there and present in all moments, in even what, if we were going to talk about something secular, it's everywhere. And so it's a device by which those resources are constantly present, and therefore, from the Buddhist perspective, you would see certain ritual devices such as liturgy as only models to enable you to, and there's actually a particular phrase, carrying onto the path, means that you sort of carry what you get from the dynamics of any kind of these ritual mediations into every moment of your waking and sleeping activity all the time, because it's, and also your invocation of the categories of the semiotic and the symbolic, at least from what I understand from Gustavus' point about the semiotic, it's not as though that it's somewhere else. In fact, it's just that we don't notice it. So from the Buddhist perspective, it's a kind of training in recognizing semiotic is always functioning, actually, and certainly in linguistic practice, for example. We're talking about something that's available all the time. So that's a lot of what practice is about, is you do it so that you then don't have to practice anymore, you kind of are it. Yeah, you are it. And that's why you wouldn't like, so that from this perspective, the liturgy or prayer would be a paradigmatic example of something which actually is to be recognized all over the place.
That's beautifully said, and of course I also want to say that. But at the same time I want to say is that there's no way that you could arrive at that being your constant state without the time care that you devote
That's
to
right.
it.
Well, that's called practice.
That is practice. And Christians always want to skip the practice. They will do anything.
Well, so do Buddhists. I mean, everything.
It's universal. It's like yeah. The one universal is laziness.
I had one other comment. Oh, I'm sorry. Just, I wondered if in addition to silent prayer and liturgy as the practices that you mentioned that are transformative and critical in your overall approach, what is there a place for icon reverence of icons, or like sort of imagistic aesthetic taking in some of the rich sort of tradition of painting, sculpture, icon. In the Christian tradition, it's immense, and I know I can see a possible. I can see a lot of possible prayerful takings in of many different images in the Christian tradition, especially of Jesus, that are quite gender transgressive, like amazingly so, and coming out of like the medieval period or earlier. And for me, one such image has been the wound in Jesus' side, and how that has, and even just understanding in someone, the thought of someone like Julian Milovich, and how that wound has all sorts of gender transformative resonances. So, for me personally, that's been an incredibly important prayer practice. I wondered if you might.
Yeah, I actually, there's a whole chapter in the first volume which is precisely about the iconic and how not only must one be transformed by starting, I think the foundational nakedness and terror that you encounter in silence cannot be averted or avoided. But what follows from that is a transformation potentially of all dimensions of the self. And so the imagination, which plays such a crucial role in our affective disposal, and our noetic transformations as well, must also be practiced. It's interesting, isn't it, how difficult it is simply to change the imagination by fire. I mean, think of Calvin smashing all the images, and yet somehow many of the images stay curiously unchanged. How is one's imagination actually transformed? And I would say that that's where the silence and the visual have an interplay with one another, which is happening all the time in literature as well. So these pieces are not disjunct, but they actually belong together. But if you miss the silence bit, if you miss out the radical nakedness before the transcendence and terror of God, if you're always putting that off, then there's something in my view that can't actually shift.
I think this is a wonderful discussion. I think maybe we should give you a break.
What do you mean? I'm going home to write with it.
But thank you all for being such an attentive audience, and thank you all for participation, and look for our announcements next semester where we'll be continuing the conversation, and hopefully, it was wonderful the way these two talks work together, and I hope that we can take up some of the big issues. Please give me your feedback and also ideas of things to thematize.